Hello, I'm Arthurina Fears, Curator of Education and Programs at the Davis Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's virtual artist talk with Cara Romero. We'd like to begin with a native land acknowledgement. The Davis Museum at Wellesley College is located on the ancestral and unceded tribal lands of the Massachusetts people. We acknowledge the continuing presence of the Massachusetts and their relatives and neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, and pay respect to Indigenous elders, past and present. So for our webinar procedures, to participate in today's program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. And we are using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use a Q&A box to enter your questions and to upvote other questions. And we will leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. Our discussant today is Dr. Carrie Cushman, the Linda Wyatt Gruber, class of 1966, Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davis. Carrie holds a PhD in art history from Columbia University and is a specialist in the history of post-war and contemporary photography from Japan. At the Davis Museum, Carrie has curated 4 exhibitions, including Making Not Taking, Portrait Photography in the 19th Century.
Thank you, Arthurina. It's been quite some time now that I've been anticipating and looking forward to our talk with the contemporary fine art photographer, Cara Romero. I first learned about Cara's important photographic practice about 2 years ago from our director at the Davis, Lisa Fishman. And it wasn't long before we were lucky enough to be able to acquire for the Davis one of Cara's most monumental works, Last Indian Market, which I believe she will tell us more about in just a bit. An enrolled citizen of the Chemehuevi Indian tribe, Cara Romero was raised between contrasting settings: the rural Chemehuevi Reservation in Mojave Desert, California, and the urban sprawl of Houston, Texas. Romero's identity informs her photography, a blend of fine art and editorial photography shaped by years of study and a visceral approach to representing Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultural memory, collective history, and lived experiences from a Native American female perspective. As an undergraduate at the University of Houston, Romero pursued a degree in cultural anthropology. Disillusioned, however, by academic and media portrayals of Native Americans as bygone, Romero realized that making photographs could do more than anthropology did in words, a realization that led to a shift in medium. Since 1998, Romero's expansive oeuvre has been informed by formal training in film, digital, fine art, and commercial photography. By staging theatrical compositions infused with dramatic color, Romero takes on the role of storyteller, using contemporary photography techniques to depict the modernity of Native peoples, illuminating Indigenous worldviews and aspects of supernaturalism in everyday life. Maintaining a studio in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Romero regularly participates in Native American art fairs and panel discussions, and was featured in PBS's Craft in America 2019. Her award-winning work is included in many public and private collections internationally. Married with 3 children, she travels between Santa Fe and the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation, where she maintains close ties to her tribal community and ancestral homelands. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Cara.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cara Romero. Thank you so much for tuning in today, logging on, and it is my great honor to be here and share about my journey to becoming a contemporary fine art photographer, and a little bit about the narrative that goes into many of the pieces and process. And anyways, without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk a little bit more about my biography and get right into the body of work, because we want to leave enough time for people that have questions to ask questions. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Carrie. My name is Cara Romero, and I was born in Inglewood, California, but shortly thereafter, my family moved to the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation, located here in the Mojave Desert of California, which is where I am sharing my screen from today and logging in from today. So we are in San Bernardino, California, and our ancestral territory is a large, vast part of the Mojave Desert, and this is the place that I am very much connected to. We are known for basket weaving, so most museums that do hold collections of Chemehuevi artwork, this is our highest and most prized form of art. They are made from the willow found down by the river and now under the lake of Lake Havasu, and the black design is Devil's Claw. I just wanted to share a little bit about the landscape that I'm from. So as Carrie was saying, I had both a biracial and bicultural upbringing. My dad is Native American and my mom is Anglo, and I grew up both on the reservation as well as in Houston, Texas. The reservation is a very rural, very culturally private Indian reservation in the Mojave Desert, and then my other formative years were spent in the regular suburbs of Houston. And that was a really interesting experience for me, especially as a young person, to come from a reservation and realize that, you know, all of the kids that were my age and the adults really had no grasp of what it was to be Native American. They had no idea what a reservation was, what reservation life was like. And many of the interactions that I had as a young person were, I think, very confusing. They were, you know, they start out really early in elementary school with really bizarre Thanksgiving, you know, Thanksgiving celebrations where Indians are celebrated and taught about in both an inaccurate and stereotypical way. So I went to elementary school with kids that put on, you know, turkey feathers and banged oatmeal boxes in celebration of Thanksgiving. And it was really disillusioning as a young child. There were, of course, the mascot issues growing up. And I think I'm from a generation where we just really internalized all of this as very bizarre. Like any way that we were represented in the media, we knew that that wasn't a truth, but it was something that we all had to endure. And to be quite honest, that we still endure as people are getting a better grasp on how to engage with their Indigenous communities. And thank you so much for that beautiful land acknowledgement at the beginning of this. So I think that all of that experience really informed me as a young person in really wanting my entire life to see myself or my family from Native America represented in any kind of accurate way. But going into college, I was an anthropology major, and everything was taught really in the past, that we were relics of the past. All of the photographs in the textbook were historic photos, and there was really like a century of really rich, thick context that was missing from everything. That was missing from my real lived experience. And so I very fortunately took a black and white photography class in my senior block at the University of Houston. It was my first photography class that I had ever taken, and it was very quickly an instant love for me. I realized that this was my opportunity to go out and document and share visually with the rest of the world what I knew to be true about modern Native peoples. And that was what I set out to do in 1998. I ran off to art school at the Institute of American Indian Arts and continued on when everything switched over to digital, and got another degree in photography technology and digital and commercial. And all of that journey really fused back together to create the style that I'm known for. So a little bit more, these slides in the background, just to kind of share, because I know it's so different from Massachusetts. I don't know how many people have been to the Mojave Desert of California. It's very vast, it's very rural, but it is the second most biodiverse place in the world behind the rainforest. So we have a lot of wildlife, a lot of incredibly pristine habitat that, you know, I was fortunate enough to grow up around. And that experience growing up, an Indigenous worldview really informed a great part of body of my work that is kind of entrenched in the narrative of our cultural landscape. So it's one of the things that I really like to concentrate on is how we as Indigenous peoples are not separate from our landscape, that we hold our landscape and our sacred sites kind of in a different space than I would say Western and colonial vantage points, where we tend to be much more focused on stewardship of the land and health of the entire ecosystem, and consider ourselves part of that ecosystem. And now I'll get into some of the work, and this is more, this first section on cultural landscape is really focused on the landscape that I'm from, the Mojave Desert. This one is called Nipton Highway, and these are my two sons in the middle of the road at sunset. So we're from the land of the Joshua trees. Right on the border of California and Nevada is where my family comes from. This one is called Jackrabbit and Cottontail, and the story behind this one has to do with, this was my first play with our tribal mythos and incorporating Jackrabbit and Cottontail, who were warrior twins and brothers that essentially made the earth habitable. And so this has kind of a surreal feel to it, where linear time has gone away and we have a blend of ancient and contemporary, a play on color, making it look like what I call 70s bad film, which was the shoebox of photos that I grew up with and our Volkswagen Bug. This one is similar to the one that we grew up with. So really a lot of autobiography in this piece, and really beginning, this was my first piece where I was really beginning to examine how our mythos can be reinvigorated in modern times visually. And that's a theme that comes up quite a bit. Our intimate relationship to the Colorado River, which is in our backyard. Again, here, that ontological tie to the landscape that we're from, being inseparable from it, being from it, that our DNA emerges from this place. This series is called Water Memories. I'm going to go through them so you can see all three together, and then I'll go back to the first one. So this series was conceived of in response to kind of a mind's eye image of natives underwater in response to climate change, and really thinking about sea level rising. And I had this vision in my mind that kind of harnessed my imagination and my creativity, and I spent a lot of time in my sketchbook trying to flesh out ideas, making sure that they're layered with a lot of content is very important to me. And I began to realize that this great flood that was in my mind also had historical context as well. That our tribe and many tribes like mine were flooded out of their ancestral territories in the name of reforming the United States after the Great Depression and in harvesting hydroelectric energy. So the dams that were built all over the United States typically went into the ancestral territories and fertile valleys of Native Americans in the 30s and 40s. So there became a second theme to these pieces. And I chose models. I work with friends and family that were also, like Chemehuevis, affected by flooding, either in the past through hydroelectric energy or in contemporary context through climate change. So the first ones have been affected by wildfires, and their village now floods. These two are from Eufaula, Oklahoma, as well as Chinookpahanska Luger is from Fort Berthold and Standing Rock, where they were flooded out by Lake Sacagawea and put up on a chunk of clay, and then they found oil. This next series is a series very much rooted in the same theme of cultural landscape, and you'll see that that first image, Jackrabbit and Cottontail, where I began to play with our mythos, comes back here. I was asked to participate in the Desert X Biennial and create a series of billboards from on the Gene Autry Highway from Palm Springs to Los Angeles. And the theme of the Desert X Biennial was 25 international artists were to respond to the landscape of Coachella Valley. Now we share Coachella Valley ancestrally with 4 other tribes, and I was the only Indigenous person in the history of the Desert X Biennial that was asked to participate in this response to the landscape. So I decided that our little time traveling characters, our little time traveling warriors, would come and visit this shared ancestral landscape of Coachella Valley and respond. And this kind of goes to this idea that all of our ancestors in our Indigenous worldview are still very much around us and beside us and experiencing all of the changes that we experience. And twofold, I think the other focus on this series was to really ground people in California, that they are in fact on Indian land. And due to erasure in media and education and very purposeful erasure of California Indian history, most people are not familiar with their local Indigenous communities other than you know, casinos or whatever, you know, 2 pages they may have learned about in school. And some of that is even inaccurate. So 4 boys from my reservation in California participated in this series, and in response to the development, we created this piece called Evolvers, which is both, I think in the title, embraces this idea of renewables, but reminds people that these landscapes that seem empty and vast are rich with Indigenous history. And that what may seem like an area that would be easily unaffected by large solar or renewable developments are actually the tide pools of the desert. So this one is Indian Canyon. protection of a sacred site. Response to the political landscape. The border wall is an issue for many Native Americans here in the Southwest that have traversed the border and also possess ancestry from both sides of the border, including these boys have ancestry that traverses the colonial border. You'll see pop culture arise in my photographs. That's very purposeful, and we'll move into another section where I talk a little bit about that and what that contemporary Native American images that incorporate pop culture or dominant culture. This was a piece that was created during the pandemic here on my reservation just about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago. We're known for bird singing here in California, and it took a couple times to get this just right at sunset, but it was my favorite piece that I've created during the pandemic, where we took separate cars out to the site. These are 2 sets of brothers. And of course, we were able to socially distance because they're far up on a hilltop. So this idea of pop culture and our indigeneity is something that it's kind of been like an aha moment for myself. And it really started out with kind of playing humorously with some different ideas about how we're portrayed in the media, and this idea of what Native American artwork is and is like. And when I first started out, I believe I really emulated what was out there, which I think most people know and are familiar with Edward Curtis's ethnographic documentation of the vanishing race. And it's such a beautiful body of work, but it is problematic for a couple of reasons. I think for the modern Native person, it's problematic because it just captured these beautiful images, captured everybody's imagination, and really solidified what Native Americans were in people's imagination and in their education. And we didn't vanish. We're flourishing and thriving in several different communities throughout the globe, really, and here in the United States. But you don't see us reflected in contemporary times. People often go back to this idea of the Curtis Indian. And this series with Buffalo Man was this idea that we would take this performance artist, Buffalo Man, who is Marcus Ammerman, and we would place him in pop cultural, iconic images. Sorry, I couldn't get that word, iconic images. And just see what happened. And so we gathered together our friends in just a very social, casual way. This was taken during a Thanksgiving break in 2014 or 2015. And we all got together on a Sunday to recreate Da Vinci's Last Supper with all contemporary Indian artists and our favorite performance artist, Buffalo Man. And so from left to right, I'd love to just spend a little bit of time with this image because this is the image that's there at the Davis. From left to right, that's Chris Eyre. He is the director of Smoke Signals. Amber Dawn Bearrobe is an art historian, educator, and I like to call her a fashionista. She's heavily influenced by the Native American contemporary fashion medium here in Santa Fe, Doubting Thomas is Kenneth Johnson. He is a Seminole jeweler. Next is Diego Romero, my husband, as Judas, his self-cast as Judas. Next is Darren V. Hill Gray. He is a Jicarilla Apache painter. Kathleen Wall is a Jemez Pueblo sculptor and ceramicist. Marcus Ammerman as Buffalo Man. He is Hopi Choctaw and a master artist of many mediums, from beadwork to glass to fashion to performance. Next is Marian Denapaw. She is from Okeowinge. Her and her husband, just 2 places over, his name is Steve Lawrence, are silversmiths. And in between them is Pilar Agoyo. She is a very well-known seamstress in the film industry of New Mexico and an incredible fashion artist. Chinupa Hanska Luger is a mixed media artist known for sculpture. We have Linda Loma Haftawa, who is Hopi Choctaw, printmaker and educator at the Institute of American Indian Arts for 35 years. And on the far end is America Meredith. She is a Cherokee painter and editor-in-chief of a very wonderful publication called First American Art Magazine, known in our community as FAM. And that's an incredible, written by natives for natives. And I think the aha moment of this piece was really that it was just so well received cross-culturally. And for me, I really think that a couple of the epiphanies for me were that this really kind of flips the script, as they say, or flips the lens. And I think most Native American photography is about this desire to have a glimpse into our culture, you know, and our cultural privacy and our ways of being and our ways of life. But this is very, you know, it's very simply reverses the narrative and creates this dialogue that's very truthful about how we are entrenched in pop culture, that we are fully literate in dominant society and, you know, European art and all of these, you know, contemporary ideas. And I think for me, it's just the success of this piece is really rooted in the sense of humor, right? Humor is medicine, laughter is medicine. So it kind of creates this healing and places us here in color as ourselves, really sharing a great truth about how we're part of pop culture as well, although we are not always portrayed as such. This one is called TV Indians, and I'm going to go just a little bit faster. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. This is a dreamscape, but you'll see, I call this one a postmodern Curtis. So you'll see I intentionally used the sepia tone on this one and the figurative landscape. And on the TV is very nuanced. You'll see many ways that Native Americans are portrayed in the media. So you'll see Tonto and Lone Ranger and Little Big Man and Iron Eyes Cody and Billy Jack. This was another piece in that series with Buffalo Man, again playing with the John Lennon Yoko Ono. And this is really a much more recent piece, and where this kind of play with pop culture narrative kind of meets that other idea of our mythos being recreated, and so both ever-changing and permanent. So kind of playing with this idea of how the mythos has come through time and is still very much a part of who we are as contemporary Native peoples. This one is called Coyote Tales #1, and he is a fabled trickster in our storytelling. This next series is called First American Girls. It's a play on the American Girl dolls. And again, going back to being a very young person and wishing we had accurate representation that celebrated our diversity from all of our different tribes, because we're all so different. So I created a series of life-size doll boxes where each woman from her respective tribe could be displayed almost in like this museum diorama with all of her surrounded by all of her cultural accoutrement that each model chose, sometimes with the help of their mothers, and celebrate really the different bioregions each person is from, and the incredible customs of regalia that really exist against all odds. So being passed down through generations in the face of genocide and boarding schools and, you know, cultural persecution. I think it's quite spectacular, all the different beautiful ways of being we still have intact. This is Northern Chumash, so this is Naomi, and her mother is a celebrated regalia maker in California. So really celebrating this intergenerational love, I think, is very unique in how we dress our young, and how this really takes a look at what we consider the wealth of our culture, which is often from the landscape. And all of these things that adorn these women and their regalia also speak to the health of the ecosystem. So it even goes back to that first idea of how ontologically tied, intrinsically tied we are to our landscapes in every way, and how we make beautiful things when our landscapes are healthy. Unfortunately, this piece also speaks to the grave environmental concerns that we're having right now. There has been a moratorium on abalone, which is the large star, and all of the beautiful shells that are hanging from her due to climate change, as well as the pine cones are on fire right now. So kind of also a grim reminder that our culture is tied to the health of the landscape. I don't think that the sound is, oops. I wanted to show just quickly how we make the doll boxes. So they look like they've been photoshopped, but we've actually hand built all of these life-size doll boxes and created kind of like these dioramas for these young women. So it's a very collaborative process between myself and the models for each one of these. So that was just a very quick behind the scenes of what goes into making these doll boxes. This is Julia from Cochiti, as well as Julia and her daughter Jocelyn. This one is Arla Lucia, a more recent piece for me. And the color is a little bit different for this one because we actually made a photogravure, which is a etched copper plate in the same style as Edward Curtis. So again, you'll kind of see those references back to Curtis. And for the final section that I wanted to share, you know, I'm from a tribe that has a great amount of gender equity. I'm very proud of my tribe for having a lot of women leadership. Our creator is female. We have kind of just this inherent strength, even through our mythos, where women are powerful in their many different forms and personalities. And I feel like that, as I've come into a woman of my own, has given me great strength to go out and do many things. And I wanted to share kind of that way that we feel about ourselves. I do a lot of decolonizing self-image through matriarchy, and this also speaks to the medium of photography being dominated by white males, and the powerful shift of having a Native woman behind the camera, I think is very powerful. not being, not having control over our bodies and how we feel about our bodies have been these incredible themes that have emerged for me through these figurative pieces that come from a very maternal place, that also incorporate stories of mythos and creation. This one is very specifically about clay woman, and this is a clay artist from Santa Clara Pueblo, with a Mesa Verde design overlaid. She's painted in clay. So all of these are very thoughtful and have a lot of meaning, and are really meant to empower our women and our life-giving abilities. They're meant to kind of work in magical realism and show the supernatural in everyday life is another theme that comes up for me quite a bit. Celebrate our connection to our landscape, our sisterhood, our intertribal relationships, our strength and ways that we don't always see ourselves portrayed for our inherent strength. This is my daughter. And this is another very recent piece called Abigail. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm kind of watching the time, so I hope I left enough time for us to have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Cara, for sharing your work with us. I learned so much today. And for example, you know, before the webinar started, you and I were discussing the narrative elements in your work, and I've always seen those narratives come through in the tensions that you're able to create, like powerful visual tensions. And today I learned how you do that, you know, through things like blending the ancient and the contemporary, your use of color, your incredibly careful staging and planning for things like the handmade dollhouses. It it seems to me that beyond creating really stunning images, these elements all come together to tell stories that I previously had interpreted as a really powerful educational tool for non-natives, for settlers, to learn more about the realities of contemporary Native experiences. But I also heard you today talking a lot about how this is for you and in your community in the Chemehuevi tribe, but also in the regions where you work in California and New Mexico. I mean, just the array of impressive people that you brought together for works like Last Indian Market, or the little boys that you've been working with since COVID-19. I wonder if you can tell us more about those relationships in your community with your friends and family who work with you, and you know what it's like for you all to create these compositions together.
Thank you so much for that question. So I think that that is really important to me, and it's something that I had to learn along the way with seeking to work within the medium of photography. The way I talk about it is that we seek to indigenize that medium. And one of the things that you have to really face as a photographer is the exploitive nature of photography, and especially as it relates to Native American subject matter. Mm-hmm. And so I really took a look at that in my 20s about how can I make work that serves as what I call artivism, that serves as a way to like give back to my community. And one of the ways that I decided for sure was to work with friends and family. There's like really a collaborative process. One, because I know I'm staying true to story, right? It's my story. It's, and sometimes staying really true to your own story as, you know, as a mixed race person, as an enrolled tribal member, is really the best way to express both your own true identity and a way for other people to connect with their own. And so working with friends and family also allowed me to make sure that the stories that we were telling were like agreed upon, you know, like do we all like this idea? Like, let's sit down and talk about it. I let my models and, you know, sometimes the parents like take a look at them and make sure that they like the way that they're being portrayed. And so it is very much about giving back to my community. And I think that as a Native person, we are held to really strict cultural protocols, like within our communities. So I think that non-Native or maybe photographers from other backgrounds can go out and just create whatever they want to. But I would say that we represent our entire, not only our small communities, but even our larger communities. So we really have to be incredibly culturally sensitive to, you know, where we hail from. And anyways, I hope that that answered your question. I think it was a really, really good one, but I do work with friends and family. And when I also find that there's just so much beauty in my backyard. And so I don't have to go very far to share these incredible stories with people.
Well, you've certainly, I think, taken your responsibility very seriously and created powerful work with it. So thank you. While we're talking about community and artivism, I love that word. I think we have a lot of artivists among our students on Wellesley's campus, and I think a lot of our students are turned in today. We have a very robust studio photo program at Wellesley, and also a very active Native American Student Association. I wonder if you can speak to advice or strategies that you have for our students on living and working as a Native artist.
Sure. So I think first of all, for me, when I go back and I lecture to Native photography departments or photography departments, I like to show my early portfolios so people can kind of see like where I was at. And I think, you know, this is a time to be learning and to be experimenting and honing in on craft. So once you get to the place where you can create high craft, then you have to make sure it has content. But for now, you need to make sure that you're technically sharp. And that takes thousands of hours in any medium, whether you're painting or in the dark room or even in the digital dark room. It takes a lot of hours playing around, learning your own strategies. And then I had shared with Carrie in an earlier conversation that I really set out to be a photojournalist and a photo documentarian. And I think I also took the industry standards way too seriously. You know, like photographers have this really serious, rigid, especially when it was film switching over to digital, about what is Native art, what is good photography. And I think it really took me being 35 years old saying like, I don't care what anybody says about what they think it's supposed to be. Like, if I'm not creating these pieces that are in my imagination, then I'm not doing anything. And so I really kind of scrapped everything that I learned in school about what I was supposed to be or what I was supposed to be doing. And I found it very liberating. And so when I say that, I think it took all of those experiences, like to make the artwork that I make. I try and do everything I can possibly do in camera, because Photoshop can never substitute for incredible lighting and perfect exposure and all the information, whether it's on film or in the digital capture, that all comes from like really formal technique. And then hours and hours learning Photoshop, you know, which is like, how are you going to use it? Are you going to use it to like sprinkle stars in the sky and make it more red and tell a really good story? Then that's great. You know, if it's like doing something to illustrate and create content and it's done really, really masterfully, then that's where it's at. And to me, it's always, always, always about content. I think when you're working to like hone in on that craft, you're going to have a lot of like really playful ideas. So design is really important. It's really, really, but when you're talking about artivism, you're really having to do like the hardest part. And for me, like if the piece just doesn't have enough content, it's not successful, you know? And I think like with my particular medium and probably like with a lot of different artists medium, like when it can all come together and like this piece that can create dialogue, that can give back to your community, that can connect with some other person emotionally, like maybe some struggle that they've been through, if it can make them laugh. Like to me, that's the most amazing thing about art. So.
I really like how you've pointed out this ceaseless commitment to learning, you know, to constantly learning, but also being open to unlearning. Yeah. And I wonder if, just the last brief question before I hand it over to our attendees' questions, if you have learned or unlearned anything significant in the past 6-7 months since COVID-19. I was so glad to hear that you have managed to continue creating work during that time. I wonder what it's been like for you.
So I'd like to answer that question both ways. I think the first thing that I had to unlearn was that digital art was bad. Because there was a time that if it wasn't film, then it was shit. And I was like, and I really like internalized that to the point where I loved to use Photoshop, but I didn't anymore because I thought it wasn't good. And now I'm kind of fascinated by this idea that I can create this artifact out of thin air, right? Like now I can, you know, create these big, beautiful pieces out of seemingly digital information, you know, and that it's really about the high craft of the artifact that you're creating. And so I had to kind of unlearn that and learn to be myself and do what was in my heart. And then I did have, like, everything just evaporated in March and April. It was like, you know, I'm at a point in my career where I have like the next 2 years slated, right? And there were the shows and the series and the sketchbooks and everything was lined up for production over the summer to have a big show here and a big show there. And we just kind of like watched it all evaporate. And I think I let that go on for about 3 months, but I think it's just the artist spirit. Like you have to get back to work, you know, and I felt like, you know, art is also kind of like a salvation for a lot of us that are put together a little weird like me. And so it becomes part of like your spiritual health. And I think part of the reason that we do it also is like that never ending learning that happens. There's always problems. Like there's always like, how am I going to solve that problem? Whether it's about content or location or whatever. And so then it kind of became about, well, what can I create that's meaningful by myself? You know, or like, how can I do this at a social distance? You know, and I think those pieces look more introspective, you know, and sometimes I think you have to just create the space. Like, I don't think you can be so in control of the artwork that you can really, like, as a spiritual person, make space for the artwork to happen, you know, with like that incredible intention and all your skills, and be like, okay, this is everything that I've learned. I'm gonna, you know, create this space and see what happens. And I have this idea, but you're not completely in control. And I think sometimes the art will make itself happen, or that there's a certain amount of what the universe is trying to show you as the artist. Sometimes I look at pieces like Last Indian Market and I'm like, I can't even believe I was behind the camera. Like, how did that whole moment come together? And it's like really about creating this space and then this like incredible magic of art and humanity. And, anyways, I hope that answers your question.
It does, and the magic comes through in the image for all of us. So thank you so much for indulging me in my questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Arthurina now to take some questions from our attendees.
So we have a few questions from our attendees, and one of them was curious about, you're mentioning using a sketchbook. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of using your sketchbook, and if you could talk a little bit about your art experience as well?
Sure. So using a sketchbook was not something that I always did, but when I went to school for commercial photography, there was a lot of emphasis on graphic design. And in any art school that you go to, even as a photographer, there's usually a lot of 2D arts. So I could always draw a little bit. I was not like the gifted illustrator that, some people just are that at 7 years old. But what I did realize in drawing and photographing simultaneously was that if I had the placement of the composition roughed out, the photography was better. And it was tried and true over and over and over. If I knew approximately what I was going for in the composition, again, I could hold space for like letting the magic happen, but I had a pretty good idea, or sometimes 20 different ideas, right? And so when you're going into productions like I do, where you've spent some money and invested some money, or, even if you're not at the point of investing, you're like clearing out some space to go photograph. For me, those sketchbooks are like the remembrance of ideas, that you really want to focus on. So sometimes they're handwritten ideas, but a lot of times they are thumbnails. So like vertical, square, like small renderings of like, where is the person in the frame? What's going on in the background? Where are you going to have a big object? Where is the horizon line? Because photography is really technical, and you can get lost in the technical and forget to see. So for me, it's like going like a band going with a playlist. My sketchbook is like, these are the things that I'm going to go for, and it's one less thing to think about when I'm there.
And for the next question, it's, do you see the artists who model for you as creative collaborators in a way that might be different from others who engage with you to make these photos?
I think I love all my subjects. I think sometimes the piece has been created for that particular person. So there's a certain amount of editorial in the piece of like this, and all of the women, it's like to give them agency. They're not like Santa Clara women. Like that one with the flying hair is Ka. The next one is Nikki. All of the ones in the doll boxes are named by their name because that's who they are. So there's this, great amount of editorial. And I feel like that kind of goes back to that question about the exploitive nature of photography, and always making sure that your Native American women and models have agency in what they're creating. So yes, very collaborative. I think I'm really trying to like pull out that, like the ways that I've fallen in love with them, like how can I make everybody fall in love with them? I think also like kind of comes out in the images. I have a lot of them on my walls or in my home, and I'm like, they come from a very loving place.
And for our last question, one of the it's a literature professor is asking about your work, which clearly engages with other contemporary arts and artists. So they were curious if you've been inspired by any contemporary writers as well.
I have, like, so the first time I picked up a Louise Erdrich book when I was a young woman, she completely, like, you know, broke open my heart as somebody that was young and alone. Gosh, I almost got emotional talking about it, but yeah, definitely Louise Erdrich and her use of the supernatural in everyday life. But I do, I read a lot of nonfiction too. So I'm really like, I don't know if that informs my artwork, but I would imagine it does. Like, I'm really interested in learning how to articulate about contemporary Indigenous issues. I just picked up a textbook on indigeneity and graphics, and I'm like, I think he's talking about a lot of the stuff I do. So like, I'm going to learn how to like talk about it better, or, you know, so I hope that answers your question, but hands down, Louise Erdrich has been a huge influence on me, and I'm just such a huge fan of her work.
Great. Well, thank you so incredibly much, Cara, for sharing your amazing work with us. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we hope that you can join us for our next virtual event this fall, including Mindful Meditation on October 6th, and the Handmade Photography Today virtual artist talk series next taking place on Thursday, October 22nd, and November 12th and December 10th. And thank you again so much. Take care.